Gary Robbins, welcome back to the podcast, buddy. Thank you so much for doing this.
Hey, thanks for having me, man. I really appreciate you reaching out.
So, skipping the formalities, as much as I want to do a long form catch up with you, buddy, obviously there's going to be a lot of people who are eager to hear from you about, the sort of major news that has evolved in our wonderful sport and our wonderful community that you have unfortunately been the focal point for. And we are going to just orient our entire conversation about this, and we'll save our long-form catch up.
I thought this was going to be about my recent 27-kilometer victory at the Frosty Mountain races in Manning. Is that not what we're talking?
Yeah, I wanted to hear.
I really wanted to talk about me right now.
We'll save all your heroic athletic achievements for a different podcast.
All right.
But it's now been about a week since you learned about Ironman and UTMB starting a new race in Whistler, formerly the home of your race, Whistler Alpine Meadows, affectionately known as Wham, a very popular race in the local community that I had heard nothing but positive things about. And before we back up in the timeline, I would love to hear you talk about, how you learned that this happened, because you had said in your blog post that you got some sort of a communication from Ironman and UTMB the night before this was announced publicly. So let's start there, and then we'll go backwards in the timeline. How did you hear about it, and what was your initial reaction?
Yeah, I was watching the Big's backyard unfold. There were only a couple of laps to go at that point, unbeknownst to all of us. I thought I might be up for another 20 hours, but my business partner, Jeff Langford, messaged me that we had just heard from the point contact on the Ironman side of things that we were getting a courtesy heads up about what was going live the following morning. So I don't know what time it went live. It was there when I woke up at 7 a.m, but essentially that was about 14, maybe 15 hours before this went live at best. Call it a dozen hours was the first time we had heard anything about it.
And your initial reaction? Complete devastation and disbelief, more or less?
Yeah. I mean, complete shock, and still very much confused and shocked about everything and how this all went down. And doing my best to just process on a day-to-day basis and try to keep moving forward.
Okay. So then going back in time, Gary, I think it's going to be important to set the context here. And I think it's really important to establish your long-term vision for Wham. A few years ago, your partner, Jeff Langford, who you just mentioned, and I gathered on a Zoom call so you could sort of share with me your guys' longer-term vision for the race at Wham and building it into like kind of an international destination type event. So for those who aren't familiar, just set that context. When did Wham start? Where does it sit in your portfolio of races, and what were your longer term ambitions for it?
So the first edition of the race was in 2016. And then we got to the 100-mile distance, which was always the kind of goal with what we were doing there for 2019. And in July of 2019, we commissioned a 5-year, commissioned through a friend, essentially a 5-year vision of what we wanted to do with the races in Whistler. All of us believing in entirety at that point in time that this could rival UTMB eventually, and be a race a month after that would attract an international group of people to Whistler. And reviewing that 5-year plan here this morning has been quite sad to see. In 2019, the fifth year, being 2024, was everything from arts and culture and festivals and what we wanted and intended to do from the start. There's an event in Whistler called Crankworks mountain biking. And we always thought that we could create the Crankworks of ultra running in Canada. And here we sit 5 years after we first put that 5-year vision forward, and we no longer have a race in the community.
Race directors are, of course, at the mercy of the permitting agencies. And it seems like at some point after a few successful runnings, things began to get rocky with Wham and your relationship with Vail Resorts, which owns Whistler Blackcomb, the resort destination. Can you sketch the arc of that relationship and where things began to deteriorate between CMTR and Whistler?
So the earlier editions of the race operated entirely outside the tenure of Vail Resorts, Whistler Blackcomb. And at that point, there was a different ownership group as well, who had, if you ask the community, were a bit more balanced in their approach to everything. The new ownerships group have had a very complex, muddy relationship with the township of Whistler since they took over. And we eventually started expanding the races and going on to Vail Resorts tenure. In 2019, all of our races, which at that point we produced a 100-miler, existed within their tenure, and it went fantastically. We had great relationships. It was produced without issue. Then, as everyone knows, we went into a pandemic, and then in 2021, we got permits to do events in just the fall season coming out of 2021. So we wanted to do something in Whistler to continue to grow and establish our weekend and our time frame there. So we did a shorter version of the races in 2021. And shortly after that was where things started to deteriorate. And we will never know exactly why, but weeks after we produced one of the only ultra running events in the Sea to Sky region in September of 2021 in Whistler on courses that we really had to thread a needle with permits that year, just based on different entities. The longest option we had was 60 kilometers. 2 weeks later, the weekend that we'd always operated on was given away by Vail Resorts to the Everesting organization. I'm sorry, I think it's the exact name of the organization is maybe 29029 or something.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. We found out about this when that organization launched their dates. And now with where we sit, looking all the way back, that was the first time that things really seemed to start not making sense for us. The races nearly never happened in 2022, and it was a miraculous effort over a period of months by our team and then other stakeholders in Whistler, because people wanted the race to continue. And we ended up sharing the weekend with the Grand Fondo Bike Race, which is thousands of bike riders through the Sea to Sky, through Squamish, up into Whistler. No easy feat for anybody, and very fortunate that that group were willing to work with us. And then after last year's 2022 version, we had attracted 1,500 runners from a dozen countries. We had produced all of our races. We had really felt like, 6 years of effort surviving through a pandemic, producing races despite not being able to do them where we wanted to over that time frame, that we established ourselves, and we felt like it was a launching point. I mean, when we went home after Wham 22, just over a year ago, once we finally all got some rest, we really felt as an organization, we were just positioned to take the next step with this event. And then we just started getting basically no clear communication. There was suggestions that there being issues, but never any foundation for what that was. And the person that we were supposed to go through for permits went through long stretches of just not responding to us at all. And eventually at the end of January, with a last ditch effort from us, as we bled into February, we were not given a clear path forward, and we were presented a permitting option that we were willing to fulfill. And I can't argue that Vail Resorts would want a more significant process at that point. We were open to it and almost expected it, just given the size of the entity. But we were then told we weren't allowed to promote the events for months further until all of this was complete. And you can't launch an event in September for registration in April or May. I think all of us understand that. So we made the hard decision that we had to walk away, and we were left with a lot of questions when that happened as to how it had deteriorated so rapidly.
In your blog post, Gary, you mentioned how you had commissioned an economic impact study about how Wham had benefited both the local municipality, but also the province of British Columbia more broadly. I'm sure that you presented Whistler with those numbers, with those facts, as you were attempting to salvage the 2023 race. Was there any reaction to the positive impact that you're having on the community from Vail Resorts?
No, I don't believe there was, to my recollection, there was never even an actual response, or once the numbers were provided, there was a lot of pressure to get those numbers to them. We did that. Eventually we had to let the process play out, and we're quite proud of those numbers. I mean, it was millions of dollars of economic activity, and there were no conversations specific to that after that study had come to light.
Yeah. And it seems like Whistler balked at providing approval for the 2023 race based on a criticism about your medical plan. I'd love to have you respond to that criticism. To what extent, to the extent you can talk about it, is it fair? Is it ludicrous? Is it somewhere in between?
It's really tough to speak about specific details with everything right now, given we still have an existing NDA that I think had a 36-month term on it, kind of thing. I think the best way to say it is that when we eventually got proper feedback from the very top of the food chain, it was clear that the information that had been put in front of that person was 50% accurate and 50% inaccurate. We never did respond to that because at that point we already knew it was not going to work. And the medical side of things, so as an organization, we've always gone above and beyond to be leaders in what we do. And we at all of our races for the last 9 years, in an 11-year history, we've had an ambulance at the finish line. We spend tens of thousands of dollars a year on our medical plan and personnel, and none of that is mandated through other communities. And I think it should be, but beyond that, we train our employees, we train the people that work with us on events. Most of them have full-time jobs and they kind of get honorariums to help us out. On backcountry wilderness first aid, like we go above and beyond to do everything we can to insulate to protect the runners that show up at our races from significant injury. And, medical plans go as far as identifying everybody volunteering on course that has medical training, and we position them, we allocate them specific to trying to give as much blanket coverage as possible. And we have a new medical provider this year, and unfortunately, the head of the previous organization that we worked with passed away shortly after the conclusion of the events. And so shout out to Doug House. We all loved working with him, but we're working with a new organization now, and they have thoroughly enjoyed us and our side and reiterated how professional they find our organization. So I guess the best way to say it is there was a very strong breakdown between upper level and us, and we all went through the same pinch point, and the pinch point was creating issues above and below that never should have made it to race weekend. And I think that's basically, we don't take it lightly. And a big part of our budget for each of the races involves professional medical coverage.
Yep. Okay, great. So it feels to me that, and I think you even say this in your blog post, that it wasn't as if they gave you an explicit, no, you can't go off with your event, but they almost forced you out from your perspective through just kind of increasing red tape. And as far as I can tell, Ironman's assertion is that they began the conversation with Whistler after you and Jeff publicly announced that you are going to be canceling Wham. Do you find that realistic? Do you feel that's honest?
The information that continues to come out since this has become public a week ago has done nothing but introduce further doubt into my mind.
Okay. So, as an observer, Ironman and Vail Resorts have two of the, toughest reputations in the outdoor and endurance sports marketplace in the industries. And so no one's sort of giving them the benefit of the doubt. And I was listening to David and Megan Roche's podcast on the subject, and they introduced something that I thought was interesting that I'd love to get your reaction on, sort of saying, they brought up that Hanlon's razor, which is like a philosophical concept of like never attribute to malice what could otherwise be explained by ignorance. And so if we were interpreting this in the most generous way, it would be that there may not have been a grand conspiracy, but that, Ironman is just like they're oblivious to the community dynamic in trail running. They're more connected with the triathlon community. What would you say to that?
Well, they come from a legal background as well, right? So I very much appreciate that balanced opinion, and I've been struggling with exactly that myself. Not specific to how they describe it, but trying to discern if this could be just as simple as lack of communication the entire way through that led to a unique opportunity that coincidentally happened to align perfectly with how things unfolded. And I am not about to say that is not a possibility, because I think it is a possibility, although the probability of it erodes daily with the response that we're seeing from the other side. And the problem I'm coming up against is everybody involved in this had clear, open communication, lines of communication with us from top to bottom. I mean, there's someone on the other side who I've known for 20 years and have a lot of respect for. And for some reason, throughout all of this, nobody communicated anything with us until the last second. And we also know with confidence it was kept very tight internally as well. So if it was as simple as coincidental timing with these two parties coming at it, I feel like we probably would have heard from them, somebody just basically saying, oh, by the way, we've decided to do this. But the way that it's all come out really puts that into question for me.
And for the record, Gary, you would know a lot better than myself. I've tried to review some things online. To what extent does the UTMB Whistler race weekend and course mimic Wham?
Substantially, as minimally divergent as necessary. From what I've seen, it's mostly just a different start and finish location and making sure that they operate entirely within their tenure and not have to look at permits outside of Vail Resorts.
And have you received any correspondence from anybody aside from that courtesy note last Wednesday?
There have since been a couple of loose prompts at like, hey, if you guys would like to talk, we're open to it, or not. And I just have no time for that right now. It's fair if they want to then claim that they're reaching out, and they have. So, but very loosely and not something that I'm putting in my calendar right now.
Yeah. So another important thing to discuss here is what you talked about in your blog post as it pertains to Squamish, another amazing event that has been in your guys' portfolio for at least a decade.
It was the start. It was the beginning of everything. So 2012 was the first Squamish 50, and that has allowed us to build a trail running series that we now maintain, a group of trail races.
So you and Jeff, after some outreach from Ironman, engaged in conversation exploring whether or not it might behoove you and the community to potentially sell that event to Ironman/UTMB. And it seems like they kind of walked away from those conversations in June of this year, if I'm not mistaken.
I went back to ensure I was 100% accurate. So the final communication was at the end of June. The first we had ever heard of them slowing down acquisitions and putting things on pause was May 23rd this year.
What do you want to say about that episode and that timing? Because that also feels a little bit strange to me, in that the conversations were ongoing and then came to an abrupt conclusion 3 months before this went public.
It's another one of those. It goes back to what the Roaches had said. Yeah. You do your best to allow for as much possibility that there wasn't malice involved. But when you really start to piece everything together, it becomes incredibly challenging to convince yourself of that.
Yeah. So let's talk about the community response, because I know this is like a really important piece of the whole thing. How have you and Jeff reacted to this outpouring of support that you've received from the community? And is there anything that stands out in your guys' private conversations together that you think are important for the community to know?
Yeah. So, when this all went down, my goal with putting something out there was simply to ensure that the community understood locally that this wasn't us, because it was confusing and some people thought that we were now working with them on this event. So really what we were looking to establish was, we have nothing to do with this. We just found out about it with you guys. It doesn't sit well, and we want to produce our own event. And the local groundswell was really incredible to see. Then watching that spill out and ripple through the North American and then cross oceans to Europe and beyond, and even it's become an international thing, was unexpected. And the nonstop level of support that we've received has been phenomenal, and really does talk to the tight-knit community that this is, even if we're all separated by major geographical distances, that we are all kind of linked together in what we want from the sport of ultra trail running that you and I and so many other people have been involved in for decades, and you and I make our living off of.
Did it surprise you?
I definitely did not anticipate or foresee this happening. It surprised me, and it's continuing to surprise me. And it's really nice for us who've been doing this for 10 years to recognize that the hardest part in all of this is that you do your best to be good people and good business people, and to uphold and preach the values of what we do in this sport, and how to be good trail stewards. And then you can feel immediately irrelevant and powerless when stuff like this happens. And to see the community kind of pick us up as well, it was something that took us by surprise, and has honestly brought both of us to like tears of joy through the emotional first few days of really processing what was happening.
Yeah. The reason I asked, Gary, just to provide a statement that you can respond to or not, is that it feels to me that if this didn't impact you personally, it would have blown over quickly, because it was a person with a sterling reputation who's universally loved in the trail running community. The community showed up to defend you, right? And there's a lot of mom and pop race organizations out there for whom this could have been the exact same copy paste situation, and the response wouldn't have happened. So in some ways, this might be a good thing for other RDs, although you're the casualty.
I agree entirely. And Jeff and I have said as much, how fortunate we are to actually have a voice in this community that allowed us to take a stand and get our messaging out there that counters a lot of what was being served kind of against us. And that is unique, and we are very fortunate for that. And you absolutely hit the nail on the head. Is it for most people would just go away really quickly, and the local race director has no say over things, and before they know it, the big businesses just steamroll them out of their community.
So looking ahead, Gary, I'm sure you can't share too many details, but you've made it clear that you intend to start a competing event, David versus Goliath. What do you want to share?
That's the name of the race. Did I tell you that? You're not supposed to.
What do you want to share about
D versus G?
I'm sure you haven't made a lot of progress in the last 6 days or whatever, but
for the last 6 days I was in Edmonton for a sports event. So yeah, this dropped and I was on a flight, and me and a buddy take a sports trip once a year. 6 months ago that was booked. I had a mostly great weekend with 55,000 fans at an outdoor hockey game. But yes, there were other things happening, and today has been the first action day for us to try to start getting things rolling here, for what we're looking to do. And we've already had a few Zoom meetings, and beyond anything else, we know we have the support necessary to make this happen. And we know the steps that are in front of us, and it's not easy or short or guaranteed, but we do know that we have the right people in the right areas that support what we're looking to do, and that gives us all the hope in the world that we can make this happen.
So before we sign off, Gary, I'd love to hear if there's anything else that we haven't covered that you want to say that's important here, because you and I spoke on the phone earlier this morning, and what you wanted to make clear is like, hey, I don't want this to lead to like universal negativity, right? Like one of the things that makes our community amazing is that we do show up for one another. And this is a perfect example of that. But also, this is a really important moment, man. Like, this is a crossroads thing. And again, unfortunately, you're the catalyst in this moment. And I'm sure thoughts have been ricocheting through your brain for the last week.
And are you implying I haven't slept for a week?
Is what I'm implying.
You might be right.
What else are we missing about this situation here that you think is important for the public to understand?
So I've heard from a few other people, locations, entities that you would not expect this group to be interested in. And I think they have thrown the net wide and far, and it's a lot more present than even I had recognized in terms of what that plan might be. The big thing for me that I've seen that I feel is relevant here is a lot of people have expressed, well, what can I do? What are the other options? And I also want to say, I'm not going to judge or fault anybody for wanting to do UTMB races. I mean, they serve a great purpose in our community on the counter to our North American permitting, where the best races in North America, you need to plan to get in 10 years in advance if you're going to hope to do Western States or Hard Rock. And you remove this big linchpin from the top where thousands of runners can go, that's not going to have a positive effect on what we're looking to accomplish as trail runners. But when the UTMB Ironman relationship began, that's when things really altered for what I perceived from my athletic side of things as being the negative. And people need to vote with their dollars and support what they believe in. But I think the biggest thing now is that I don't have an understanding of what is available out there that can mimic what is only advertised available from these UTMB races. And what I mean by that is Ellie Greenwood did a great job at trying to identify some other wonderful European races where you're supporting good organizations and you can get into the races and you're going to get everything that you might be after with beautiful, challenging mountainous terrain, a European vacation. And I think we need to find a way to just have a bit more clarity and communication around what alternatives might look like so that people can decide if you still want to go do 3 weeks in Europe and run a super crazy difficult race, you have these options. And I don't think this is the only option for people, even though it appears oftentimes that it is the only option, because there's just not enough marketing sway from these not lesser is not the right word, but lesser known races to get their message out to international communities.
Yeah, I agree. I was one of the vocal optimists when this UTMB Ironman merger occurred.
You actually helped me be optimistic.
Yeah. And, I think this is important, right? Like in that podcast, I said, I will be the first person to criticize when things deserve criticism. And I think this is one of those moments. And it feels to me like something needs to change here with this specific instance. And to the extent, they've reached out to you, maybe that's the olive branch that might start a broader dialogue. But I think the important thing that I've learned as I've now entered the world of race directing is that it is a time of squeeze, right? It is a time of corporatization. And like, even for our small events too, you do feel a little bit of that pinch, right? Because we don't offer stones, because we're not part of the UTMB World Series. And, at the end of the day, we are just as important to the fabric of the community as...
Not just as, we're more important. We're building the community that they depend on for their massive events to succeed.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, Gary, I'm really sorry this has happened to you, man. And I, having been part of the conversation a few years ago, and just thinking, man, yeah, that Wham race has so much potential, right? To see that sort of
we weren't the only ones that thought it had so much potential.
Yeah. But we are at a crossroads moment here. And yeah, like I said, unfortunately, you are the catalyst, but sort of somebody has to be. And you're sort of maybe the hero we need in this situation. And, to the extent that you can sort of keep us appraised of how this evolves, I think everybody in the community would be really interested. Not only for, the race that you will hopefully be announcing in the near future, but, just anything else that we can learn from this particular situation, having a race that was really core and really important to your entire portfolio, sort of taken over by, by force almost, is at least the public perception. We can have our antennas up at this point and looking forward that this will be a moment for us to all learn and grow from together. And I think you're the perfect person to sort of carry the torch as we march into this crossroads moment in this next generation of the sport.
I don't know about that, but I do appreciate the confidence, and we'll do the best we absolutely can on this side of things. And just want to try to keep it as civil as possible and as informative as possible. And again, to allow people to make their own decisions from that point in time. I'm not going to pass judgment on anybody that makes the decisions that make the most sense for them. And it would be hypocritical of me too, because as recently as the last few years, I've kept dreaming of an eventual return to UTMB, which would never work for my personal schedule. So yeah, it's just more for me right now about getting the messaging out there and making sure that people understand what's happening. And you do with that what makes the most sense for you as a person.
Yeah. Well, Gary, let's catch up and keep things, a little bit more positive and optimistic the next time we talk.
I was only 10 minutes behind the course record in that 27K race, but you don't even want to talk about it.
Well, dude, keep me posted. I want to come up and do one of your races here in the spring or summer of 2024. And if there's anything Freetrail can do to amplify the message, please do let me know. Would be happy to be part of it. But yeah, man, thanks for coming on the show. I really appreciate your openness and your honesty and your willingness to do it.
Thanks very much for having me and for all that you do in the sport, and just for being a great human and continuing to put that energy out there every day.